Bill Browder. He is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. He was once one of the largest foreign portfolio investors in Russia before he turned activist, speaking out against Russian human rights violations. It's lovely to have you on. There is such a difficult situation still going on in Ukraine. Putin says he talked to Trump about removing intelligence and all U.S. military aid to Ukraine. But then Trump told Fox News last night that they didn't discuss that at all. Who do you believe, the former KGB operative or President Trump, who is known for having a bad relationship with facts?
Well, I don't believe anybody in this particular story. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So about a week ago, President Zelensky agreed to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire in order to have a proper peace negotiation. And then the ball was in Putin's court to agree the same. And putting aside all this nitpicking of who said what, the one thing we know is he didn't say that. He rejected the proposal for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Now, all this talk about having a great meeting and a great call and 1.5 hours, it doesn't change what's going on. Putin continues to launch his unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. And by the way, 57 minutes after Putin promised not to attack energy infrastructure, they attacked energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And so Putin can't be believed. His promises can't be trusted. And to put it quite simply, he's humiliating Trump in front of the whole world.
Wow, that's quite a statement. President Trump says the next step would be full ceasefire. How many steps away are we? Because we don't even have a partial ceasefire. And as you said, Putin has clearly said no to a 30-day ceasefire. So how far are we away from something larger?
We're a million miles away from something larger, and we're a million miles away for one simple reason, and that is that Putin has no intention of stopping his invasion of Ukraine. This is a maximalist strategy. He has not altered from this from day one. The whole point of his invasion of Ukraine was to take Ukraine, to make Ukraine a part of Russia, and then to move on to other countries. That's been his stated outward position, and he hasn't altered in one way, shape, or form. And so we're all sort of fantasizing that there's some type of peace that he's going to give. The only way that Putin will agree to any peace is if he's in a weak position. And the only way to put him in a weak position is to arm Ukrainians with a lot more than we've already given them and allow them to use those arms to hit targets inside of Russia. And if we did that, then there might be a negotiation.
You're saying that the U.S. has to show strength in its support and more support for Ukraine, which so far, I mean, they were pulling things away from Ukraine because that meeting here in the United States got so contentious. Let me ask you about how you think Europe will step in here. And can Europe step in place of the United States if they simply cannot come to any terms with Putin?
Well, Europe is going to have to step in because it appears, based on everything we've heard, that Donald Trump is going to step out. And if the U.S. steps out, U.S. supplies 40% of the financial and military aid for Ukraine, and that means that Europe will have to step in. And what we saw yesterday was that the Germans, who have always been very frugal about defense spending, have agreed on a massive $1 trillion defense increase in order to deal with. And then, of course, there's the $300 billion of Russian money that's sitting almost all in Europe, which can be confiscated. So can Europe step in? Yes and no. Europe can step in a big way financially, and there's a lot of money to be had if the Ukrainians need it. But the Americans do provide very valuable intelligence. That the U.S. has an unparalleled ability to determine what's happening on the ground and to warn the Ukrainians. And just for a few days, when the U.S. stopped providing that intelligence, there was a battlefield disaster in Kursk. And so yes and no. I mean, it's going to be ugly if the U.S. steps out, but it doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are going to surrender if that happens, because surrender is worse than what they're experiencing right now.
Claire, let me bring you in, because obviously there is very little trust on both sides here. But one reason to be hopeful is perhaps the fact that this prisoner swap appears to have gone on or been carried out without incident. 175 prisoners on both sides released. In fact, also Moscow saying that they are also releasing, or they did also release, an extra 23 Ukrainian prisoners who were wounded, seriously wounded soldiers. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, Zain, so this appears to have been, in the words of President Zelensky, one of the largest prisoner swaps, 175 soldiers on each side, plus, as you say, 22 seriously wounded Ukrainian soldiers in need of hospital treatment. This was flagged in the Kremlin readout of the call with President Trump last night. They originally said 23 seriously wounded soldiers would be released as a gesture of goodwill. It seems that 22 were eventually released, but that ultimately means that Ukraine got back a higher number of people today than Russia did. As for whether this is overall a gesture of goodwill, I think that is seriously debatable. President Zelensky has said today that this was in the works but long before that phone call between Trump and Putin. So I think it's convenient for Russia to brand this as a sort of sign of willingness to show the US that it is sort of in a conciliatory mood, whereas actually we've seen a lot of these prisoner exchanges over the course of this war. It really is the only channel of diplomatic sort of work that continues between Russia and Ukraine. This is the 62nd such release, according to an official project within Ukraine that handles the Russian military and prisoners of war. So I think that is a really key point to remember about this. It's extremely good news for Ukraine. They are working extremely hard. It's a key priority to return as many as possible of the estimated 8,000 Ukrainians who remain in Russian custody, some of them since the beginning of the war. But what this is not at this stage is evidence of Russian willingness to compromise on any of the key issues related to a potential ceasefire or peace deal.
Let's go to Washington, where we find CNN's Alex Marquardt. So this call between Zelensky and Trump has just wrapped up. It lasted about an hour. Trump is saying that it was, quote, a very good call. What details do we have on what exactly the two discussed, Alex?
Well, more broadly, Zain, I think this is certainly an effort by the Americans and the Ukrainians to get this relationship back on track. Obviously, things went really off the rails after that meeting in the Oval Office. And so since then, the Ukrainians have been trying to play nice, immediately agreeing to that U.S. proposal for a ceasefire, for a full ceasefire, I should note. And this is also the U.S. approach of essentially these two tracks, the U.S. talking with the Russians and talking with the Ukrainians and trying to bridge the gap and bring both sides together. So we saw that very important call with Vladimir Putin yesterday, which was around 2 hours long. Today's, we understand, with President Zelensky was about half that amount of time. Luckily for the Ukrainians, this does appear to have gone quite well. We do have President Trump saying that he had a very good call with President Zelensky. Of course, the main priority for the Americans has been to get this ceasefire in place, in order to then be able to talk about the much more difficult, thornier issues about a longer-term peace deal where, frankly, the Ukrainians and the Russians are still very much at odds in terms of territorial concessions, what troops will be on the ground, the size of the Ukrainian military. Those conditions, those issues go on and on and on. But this is a little bit of what President Trump had to say following his call with President Zelensky, which, again, he called very good. He said, just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It lasted approximately 1 hour. Much of the discussion was based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. That last part is very interesting, Zain, because the Russians have made clear that if there is to be peace with the Ukrainians, they do not want to see Ukraine getting military aid from the Europeans and the Americans. They don't want to see them getting intelligence support. That is something they made clear in their statement made after the Putin call. That is nowhere in the American readout of the call. And I think we need to remind our viewers that the U.S. was pushing for a full ceasefire, for the fighting to stop completely all along the front line, all across the Black Sea. But what Putin got Trump to agree on was much smaller, much narrower than that. Really, the main headline here is that the White House settled for a much smaller ceasefire. So what we're seeing now, in effect, and it will be tested, is that the Ukrainians and the Russians have agreed to an energy and infrastructure ceasefire. So just energy and infrastructure facilities that will not be targeted by either side. But that doesn't mean that the fighting will stop. It doesn't mean that Russia will stop bombing civilian centers and cities all across Ukraine. So this is much, much smaller than the U.S. wanted. They are trying to sell this as a win, but they are acknowledging that there's a lot of work to be done. And we heard the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz saying that technical teams, so that's sort of lower level, expert level teams, will be sent out from the U.S. and from Russia to Saudi Arabia in the coming days to further these discussions. But it's clear that the Russians have a lot of conditions that they have before they agree to any kind of broader ceasefire, let alone a final peace deal.